The kitchen was cold before sunrise. Not the kind of cold you fix with a sweater. This was different. The kind that seeps into the walls, into the floorboards, and settles in quietly, reminding you, without saying a word, that something, somewhere beyond your control, has already made the decisions for you. It was November 1973. And across America, people were waking up to a world that had shifted overnight. Gas stations had lines stretching 2, 3, 4 blocks. Some of them just closed, a piece of cardboard taped to the pump. No fuel today. 3 weeks earlier, you'd paid 38 cents for a gallon of gasoline. Now, if you could find it, it was pushing 55 cents and climbing. The Arab oil embargo had arrived, and it hadn't arrived politely. Heating oil was being rationed. Schools were cutting their hours to save on fuel. Grocery prices were climbing so fast that the number on the receipt looked different every single week. The government was asking families to turn their thermostats down to 68 degrees during the day and lower at night. In some states, there were rules about which days you could even buy gasoline. Odd license plate numbers on odd days, even numbers on even days. You didn't decide when you could fill your tank. A bureaucrat did. The price of a barrel of oil had quadrupled, from $3 to $12 in less than a year. Inflation was running at 9, 10, 11%. Everything cost more. Everything was harder to get, and nobody could tell you when it would stop. Her name was Doris, 34 years old, 2 children, Caleb, 8, and Ruth, 6. Her husband, Gerald, drove a delivery truck for a wholesale grocery distributor, or he used to, full-time. His hours had been cut because diesel costs had crippled the company's routes. They were running fewer trucks, making fewer stops. Doris stood at the kitchen window that morning with a cup of coffee stretched from yesterday's grounds. She watched the frost on the glass. She didn't say anything. She didn't cry. The furnace had clicked off sometime after midnight. The pantry had 11 cans. She'd counted them, twice. She didn't know how they'd get to the end of the month, but she knew 2 children were asleep down the hall, and they were going to eat. They were going to stay warm. She just didn't know how yet. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Her real story didn't start with success. It started with a decision no one noticed. The wait before the first step. Doris wasn't the kind of woman who talked about money easily. In her family, money was handled quietly. You didn't complain about it. You didn't celebrate it. You managed it, the way you managed a leaky faucet or a hard winter, steadily, without making a scene. But this was different. This wasn't a leaky faucet. This was the whole water main. She sat at the kitchen table that morning, coffee pale in her hands, cold still in the air, and she opened the drawer where they kept the bills. Not because she didn't know what was in there. She knew exactly what was in there. She opened it because she needed to see it, all of it, at once, without flinching. The heating oil bill was overdue by 12 days. The electric company had sent a notice. Rates were going up, effective immediately, part of the broader energy squeeze hitting utilities nationwide. Gerald's paycheck, when it came, would be roughly $60 lighter than 2 months ago, and inflation had already taken a bite out of everything else. Groceries, shoes for Caleb, the aspirin she'd been putting off buying. She spread everything across the table, every bill, every stub, the small notebook where she'd tracked groceries since August. She didn't reach for a pencil right away. She just looked. There's something that happens in that moment when you stop pretending and actually look at the whole picture. It's terrifying, but it's also the first honest thing, the first real thing. Caleb wandered in from the hallway, pajamas rumpled, socks mismatched. He looked at the papers on the table, then at his mother's face, the way children do, reading a room before they understand a situation. "Is everything okay, Mama?" She looked at him and smiled. A real one, the kind you have to choose. "Getting there," she said. "You want oatmeal?" He nodded, pulled out the chair beside her, leaned into her arm. She held him a half-second longer than she needed to. That was the moment. No cameras, no audience, just a woman at a kitchen table choosing clarity over denial. She picked up the pencil. Not to draw up a formal budget with headers and columns, just a list, what she knew was coming in, what had to go out, and the gap between those two numbers. In 2026, most of us never do this. We have apps, we have dashboards, but we don't sit with the numbers the way Doris did. We glance, we scroll, we close the notification. The information exists, but the reckoning doesn't happen. She wasn't doing anything complicated. She was just being honest with herself. And that, before any strategy, before any sacrifice, is where real survival begins. How did she even begin? One number at a time. Gerald called that afternoon from a payphone near his second delivery stop. The connection crackled. She caught enough. The company was talking about cutting full-time drivers to part-time through January. Nothing confirmed yet, just talk, the kind that usually means something. She didn't let him hear the pause. She asked if he'd eaten. He said yes. She told him dinner would be ready. She said she loved him. She hung up. Then she stood at the counter, hand still resting on the receiver, and felt the pull. There's a particular instinct that activates during uncertain times. It tells you to act immediately, rush out, buy things before they get more expensive, fill every available space with supplies, spend what's in the account now while you still have access to it. Her mother had done that. Every hard stretch, her mother's answer was to buy more just in case, and they'd end up with duplicate cans of things they didn't need and still no money for things they did. Doris wasn't going to do that. She went to the living room, sat on the firm end of the couch, the one that makes you sit up straight, and she thought, just thought. What could she actually control? Not the embargo, not Gerald's hours, not the heating oil schedule. But she could control the outflow. Not all of it, but some of it. And some of it was enough to start. Ruth climbed into her lap without being invited, the way small children do. She had a crayon drawing, a house, a sun, 5 figurists, and a large, improbable dog. "We don't have a dog," Doris said. "I know," said Ruth, "but in my picture we do." Doris laughed, actually laughed, and something settled back into place. Emotional restraint isn't coldness. It's not pretending. It's choosing to stay calm enough to think, to be useful, to be present when your family needs you most. In 2026, we're surrounded by systems designed to collapse that pause. Every notification, every flash sale, every "only 3 left" banner is engineered to make you act before your steady voice has a chance to speak. The anxiety spending impulse is real, and it costs more than whatever you bought. Doris chose not to follow it. That invisible, unphotographable choice shaped every decision that came after. But the grocery store was about to test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. She went on Thursday, restocking day, or it used to be. By November 1973, schedules had grown unreliable. But Thursday was still her best chance. She took Caleb. Ruth had a low fever. Gerald's mother was nearby for an hour. Caleb was old enough to carry a basket, and old enough to understand, mostly. The store felt different, not busy, taut, like everyone inside was managing something. 2 fluorescent lights were flickering overhead. One at the far end of the produce section was simply off, leaving a dim corner nobody wanted to stand in. The shelves had gaps, Not emptiness exactly, but that unsettling rearrangement stores do when they shift products to hide the spaces. The cooking oil section had a hand-lettered sign on ruled paper, "Limit 1 per family." Caleb read it slowly, didn't say anything. Doris had prepared for this. The night before, she'd spent an hour, not browsing recipes, not making a wish list, mapping out 5 dinners from overlapping ingredients. She was shopping by component, not by category. A whole chicken, 49 cents a pound. Chicken breasts, 67 cents. She stood in the aisle and did the math in her head, twice. Put the whole bird in the basket. The carcass would become broth. The broth would anchor 2 more meals. Dried beans, flour. She still had lard at home, enough for biscuits. Oats, a small bunch of root vegetables. That was the list. Caleb pointed at a cereal box with a cartoon bear. He'd seen it advertised on television. "Can we—" "Not today." He looked at her. He was 8, not 5. He understood "not today" differently than Ruth did. He understood it had weight. She touched his shoulder. "Pancakes on Saturday, maple syrup. Deal?" He considered this with complete seriousness. "Deal." She felt the particular ache of that not being able to just say yes ache. But she also knew, clearly, that yes to the cereal meant no to something that mattered more later in the month. At the register, the total came in just under what she'd planned. She exhaled slowly. Intentional buying isn't deprivation. It's the difference between spending on what you want in the moment and spending on what you actually need across the whole picture. In 2026, the friction of that aisle, looking at the price, weighing the choice, feeling the decision, has been designed away. One click, same-day delivery. The consciousness disappears with the inconvenience. But groceries weren't the biggest threat. The heating oil truck came on Friday. She'd been watching for it all week. It arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. She had the door open before the driver rang. He was young, maybe 22. He looked apologetic before he said anything. The price per gallon had gone up again, part of the nationwide supply strain that had been tightening since October, and the company was now delivering partial fills only. Distribution caps, no exceptions. How long until the next delivery? He wasn't sure. He was sorry. You could tell he meant it. She signed the paperwork and watched his truck pull away from the curb. 62 degrees. That was the floor. Below that, Caleb's asthma grew difficult, and Ruth woke from the cold. 62, and not 1 degree lower. The government was asking households to hold at 68. She'd already gone below that. Now she needed to hold the line she had. That evening, she and Gerald sat at the kitchen table after dinner, kids in their room, television off, and talked, not argued, talked. They made quiet decisions together. Gerald spent an hour with weather stripping and an old towel sealing the gap under the back door. They unscrewed 2 of the 3 bulbs from the living room lamp. The habit of leaving the kitchen light burning all evening, gone. Lights off by 9. None of these things alone were enough. Together, they added up to something real. And beyond the money, they gave the family something else, the feeling of agency. They weren't just being pushed around by the crisis. They were pushing back. In 2026, most of us have no real relationship with what we consume. Energy, subscriptions, data, it all dissolves into a monthly number we glance at. Awareness of consumption isn't deprivation, it's information, and acted upon information is the only thing that changes anything. The real test. Wednesday, the 15th. The car needed a brake line repair that couldn't wait. Gerald called from the shop. $41. In another month, manageable. This month, It landed on the careful plan she'd built like a stone through glass. She'd been protecting a small buffer for exactly this situation, but the buffer wasn't quite $41. It was $26. She sat down at the kitchen table before she did anything else, felt the cold rush of panic starting in her chest, the what-ifs stacking up, and made herself breathe, made herself stop. Then she opened the notebook. She wasn't looking for things to eliminate. She was looking for things she could delay, flexible edges she hadn't noticed before. The phone bill had a 10-day grace period. She could pay it on the 25th. The field trip deposit for Caleb's school wasn't due for 3 weeks. She could ask the teacher for a brief extension. A small gift she'd planned for her sister-in-law's birthday could be handmade instead. That ache of social self-consciousness quietly swallowed. She added it up. $21, with discomfort. Enough. She called Gerald back. Tell him to fix it. You sure? We can't drive on bad brakes, she said. Tell him to fix it. That night, after the kids were asleep, she sat alone at the table. The furnace was off. Outside, that particular November wind, the one that means winter has stopped deliberating and arrived. She felt the weight of it. Not failure, just responsibility, the specific, exhausting, unglamorous weight of being the person who holds things together. She didn't write anything, just sat. Then she got up, rinsed her cup, and went to bed. She made one bold move the next morning. The bold move wasn't dramatic. It looked like Doris walking next door at 8 in the morning with a jar of blackberry preserves she'd made in August. Mrs. Hester was 71, widowed. She had a chest freezer in her garage she'd never used more than half of, and a summer garden that always produced more than one person could eat. Doris knocked, handed over the preserves, asked plainly if she could store some chicken broth and extra bread in the freezer. Mrs. Hester looked at her, then said, "I've got space, and I baked yesterday. You want some?" That exchange, that simple, practical neighborliness, became the seed of something bigger. And watching it grow over the following 2 weeks, you could identify the shape of how families actually survived that winter. Not through any single brilliant idea, but through a set of interlocking behaviors. Here is what Doris and thousands of women like her across America actually did. The first was ingredient-led shopping. Not meal planning from recipes, but working backward from what was affordable and building meals around it. Doris never walked into a store asking, "What do I want to make?" She walked in asking, "What can I make the most of?" The second was cooking from the whole, a whole chicken instead of parts, a ham bone stretched into 3 pots of soup, a bag of dried beans that became 4 different meals across a week. Nothing expensive, nothing wasted. The third was freezer sharing, not charity, exchange. Doris stored broth and extra bread at Mrs. Hester's. Mrs. Hester passed over summer preserved vegetables, 2 households running one system. The fourth was combined errands. Across the street, the Delgado family and the Warners started alternating grocery runs. One family drove, both families shopped. 1 trip's worth of fuel for 2 households' worth of groceries. The fifth was oven stacking. When Doris's oven was on, Mrs. Hester brought over a dish of her own to bake alongside. The fuel cost, never discussed as such, was simply split by the act of doing it together. The sixth was bill sequencing, knowing which bills had grace periods and using them strategically, not ignoring bills, sequencing them, paying in the order that protected the most critical things first. The seventh was consumption mapping. Gerald and Doris went through the house looking at what drew energy, not dramatically, methodically, the draft under the back door, the extra bulbs, the morning habit of leaving lights on in empty rooms, each small thing addressed. The eighth was building in substitutes before you need them. Doris had been baking bread on Sundays since early October, not because she'd predicted a crisis, but because it was cheaper. When the crisis came, the habit was already formed. She didn't have to build it under pressure. The ninth was emotional economy, protecting the family's morale as consciously as the pantry. Pancakes on Saturday because she'd promised Caleb, the smell of bread on Sunday evenings, small, deliberate, ordinary moments that told the children and herself that life was still life. The 10th was making help a transaction, not a charity. When Mrs. Hester offered vegetables, Doris brought preserves. When Gerald's mother offered jars of food, Doris eventually accepted, but she found a way to give something back. Nobody felt like a burden. Nobody felt like a donor. It was exchange, and exchange has dignity. The 11th was delaying, not denying. The gift for the sister-in-law, the field trip fee, the non-urgent phone bill. None of these were refused, just moved, buying time without creating debt. And the 12th, perhaps the hardest, was staying in the week she was actually in, not catastrophizing about January, not spiraling about what might happen if Gerald's hours were cut further. Just this week, just this set of decisions, just today. These weren't strategies she read somewhere. They were adaptations, things that worked, kept, and were shared quietly among the women who ran households through the hardest stretch of that decade. But pride nearly ruined everything. Gerald's mother called the third week of November. She'd heard, through the careful indirection of family communication, that things were hard. She had jars, green beans, tomatoes, pickled okra Gerald never liked, from her summer canning. Did they want any? Doris's first instinct was immediate and automatic. No. Not because she didn't need it. She needed it. But there's a particular pride in people raised to handle things quietly. It's not vanity, it's armor. If you don't let anyone see the trouble, you can maintain, on some internal level, that the trouble isn't quite real. She told her mother-in-law she'd think about it, which meant no. She hung up and stood in the kitchen. The kids were at the table. Dinner was on the stove. Everything looked fine from the outside. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about her grandmother's Depression-era stories, told not with shame, but with pragmatism, the way neighbors helped each other, not as charity, but as physics. You had something, they needed it. They had something, you needed it. The whole system worked because nobody was too proud to participate. She picked up the phone and called back. "Yes," she said. "We'd love it. Thank you." A pause. Then, quietly, "I was hoping you'd say that." Gerald's mother came Saturday with 17 jars in a cardboard box and a coffee cake she'd baked that morning. They sat together and talked about the kids, about a television program, about nothing consequential. The jars sat on the counter. Doris kept glancing at them and felt something, some tightly held thing, loosen. In 2026, the support networks exist. Buy-nothing groups, neighborhood exchanges, mutual aid forums, community pantries. Most of us never use them because somewhere in us the armor is still on. Needing help feels like evidence of failure. It isn't. Using the right support at the right time is one of the most intelligent things a person can do. The families who survived 1973 understood this not as philosophy, but as practice. Pride is expensive, more expensive than most. 7 days sounds like the edge of something. It didn't feel that way to Doris. It felt like math, specific, clear, one day at a time math. The 17 jars had changed the grocery picture significantly. No canned goods needed this week, less produce. That freed up money she redirected toward the heating oil and the utility bill, paying just enough to avoid a late fee that would have cost more than the partial payment. Monday, bean and tomato stew from Mrs. Vandermolen's jarred tomatoes, dried beans, cornbread baked alongside. Caleb asked for seconds. She noticed that and held it quietly. Tuesday, a hash from the last of the stretched chicken, shredded fine, fried with potatoes and onion until it crisped at the edges. Gerald ate standing at the stove, said it was the best thing he'd had all week. She wasn't sure if he meant it. She took it anyway. Wednesday, a short walk to the store with Caleb. 2 items. Cooking oil, a dozen eggs. She paid and left. No browsing. Caleb looked at her on the walk home. "You didn't look at anything else." "Didn't need to," she said. He walked half a block in silence. "Is that how you do it? Just don't look at things you can't get?" 8 years old, already learning the things she'd spent most of her adult life understanding. "Something like that," she said. Gerald got confirmation midweek. Hours would stay reduced through December. Not eliminated, defined. You can work with defined. She called the heating oil company before the week was out, spoke to someone who sounded barely older than Caleb, and arranged a partial payment with the remainder in 2 weeks. They were kind. People usually are when you call before things go critical. The last 2 nights were simple, not sparse from failure, but spare by design. She was protecting the edge, keeping a small reserve for whatever the 1st of December would bring before Gerald's check arrived. Lights off by 8:30, kids asleep without complaint. The routine of the month had settled into them all. Children take their cues from the calm of the adults around them, and she had been, relentlessly, calm. Would it be enough? December 1st was a Saturday. She woke before the house, made real coffee, not stretched, sat at the kitchen table with the notebook. She did the final accounting, every dollar in, every dollar out. They had made it through the month. Not just barely, they had a small amount remaining, enough to pay the heating oil company in full by week's end, enough to keep the mortgage current, enough that December wouldn't start from nothing. She sat with that for a long time. It wasn't the kind of success anyone would see from the outside. The house looked the same, the children looked the same. Gerald looked tired because he was. No milestone, no announcement, just the month had happened, and they had moved through it without breaking. She thought about what it had actually cost, not in money, in the other currency. The daily, hourly expenditure of attention, the grocery store moments of choosing no, the evenings with the furnace off, not letting herself catastrophize, the phone call to Gerald's mother that her pride resisted and her good sense won, the hours spent building meals from what existed rather than what she wished existed. None of it was glamorous. None of it would make a story the way people usually tell stories. No windfall, no single brilliant insight, no dramatic reversal. Just steadiness, just showing up to the reality of the situation every single day with clear eyes. When the kids came down, she made pancakes, maple syrup as promised. Ruth got syrup on her elbow and didn't notice for several minutes. Doris laughed, really laughed, and the kitchen was warm and bright and entirely ordinary, and that ordinary felt, on that particular morning, like the finest thing in the world. The 1973 oil embargo didn't end cleanly. It dragged through 1974. It reshaped how America thought about cars, insulation, energy, and the assumption of endless cheap fuel. Some of those changes held. Many faded when the crisis eased and comfort returned, because comfort has a way of making people stop thinking. By the late 1970s, a second oil shock hit. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution disrupted global supply again. Lines at the pump returned, prices spiked again, and many of the people who had forgotten what they learned in '73 had to learn it all over again. The families who carried those lessons forward didn't just survive better financially, they thought differently. They had a relationship with their resources that most people in comfortable times never develop. They knew what things actually cost. They knew how close the margin really was. And they knew that the habits that protect you have to be built before you need them, not scrambled for once the crisis has already arrived. Now it's 2026. The specific pressures look different. The underlying reality is not. A barrel of oil that was $3 in 1973 and $12 by the end of the embargo has modern equivalents playing out in real time. Geopolitical pressures, supply chain fragility, energy price volatility that can reach your heating bill and your grocery receipt within weeks of a decision made 10,000 miles away. Inflation has already changed what your money buys in ways that aren't finished settling. And the systems that deliver goods, energy, and stability to your door are more complex and more fragile than they appear from the inside of them. Most of us, if we're being honest, have very little margin, very little buffer between what we have and what we owe, and we live in a world specifically engineered to keep us from thinking about that. Every platform, every algorithm, every frictionless checkout is designed to eliminate the pause between impulse and action, to make the cart fill itself before the quiet voice has a chance to speak. Doris had to think because there was no other option. We have to choose to think. That is a different challenge, in some ways, the harder one. So here is what her November, 50 years ago, actually teaches us, not as history, but as instruction. First, clarity before crisis. The families who navigated 1973 best were the ones who already knew their numbers, not perfectly, not formally, but honestly. They knew approximately what came in and what had to go out. When the crisis hit, they weren't starting from confusion. Open the drawer, look at it all, before you need to. Second, community is infrastructure. The freezer sharing, the combined grocery runs, the oven stacking, the jars passed between households, none of it was charity. It was a distributed system, and it worked because people let it. In 2026, those systems exist in different forms. The question is whether we're willing to participate in them before we're desperate enough to have no choice. Third, the pause is the strategy. The single most repeated behavior across every family that survived that winter well was the pause before spending, not the refusal to spend, the pause, the moment of asking, do I need this now or does it feel urgent because I'm anxious? That pause, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, a walk around the block, is worth more than any budgeting system ever built. And fourth, ordinary life protected is the point. Doris didn't spend that month trying to become someone extraordinary. She spent it protecting the ordinary, the pancakes she'd promised, the warm kitchen, the sound of her kids sleeping down the hall. The goal was never wealth, it was continuity, and continuity in unstable times is its own form of abundance. The 1970s generation didn't survive because they were tougher or wiser or more disciplined than people today. They survived because their circumstances gave them no other option. We still have options, which means we still have a choice. You can look at what's moving in the world right now, the prices, the instability, the quiet, persistent hum of uncertainty, and feel helpless. Or you can do what Doris did on that first cold morning. Open the drawer, spread it on the table, look at it clearly, all of it, without looking away. That's not pessimism. That's the beginning of every story that ends with someone still standing. If something in this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because we're asking you to, but because someone in your life might be sitting at their own kitchen table right now, looking at their own drawer full of bills, wondering where to begin. Now they know.